Here's a question nobody is asking loudly enough right now. When is the last time a sitting Supreme Court justice, someone who has been on the highest court in the land for over 3 decades, stepped in front of a crowd, looked directly into the camera, and said, "Our country is under threat"? Not from a foreign enemy, not from a terrorist, not from some outside force trying to blow up our way of life, from within, from a political movement that is actively, deliberately, and systematically trying to replace the very foundation this country was built on. Justice Clarence Thomas just did exactly that, publicly, on camera, on the record. And if you haven't heard about it, if your news feed didn't explode with this story, that should tell you everything you need to know about who controls the narrative in this country and why they don't want you thinking too hard about what he actually said. Because what he said, it was a warning, and it was aimed directly at the heart of modern American politics. Look, if nobody in your life is breaking down stories like this one for you, that's exactly why this channel exists. We don't have corporate sponsors telling us what to say. We don't have political action committees funding our opinions. It's just us, the facts, and the truth, unfiltered. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss what they don't want you to know. Join the Nation Pulse community. This is a movement, not just a channel. Now let's get into it. It was Wednesday evening, April 16th, 2026, the University of Texas at Austin, a packed auditorium, students, faculty, legal scholars, future lawyers. The occasion? The 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And the speaker wasn't a politician, it wasn't a pundit. It wasn't a cable news commentator trying to score points before the commercial break. It was Justice Clarence Thomas, the longest-serving justice currently sitting on the United States Supreme Court, a man who has spent over 30 years on the bench interpreting the Constitution, the same document that governs every single law in this country, every right you have, every protection you rely on. And here's what makes this moment so significant. Clarence Thomas almost never does this. Supreme Court justices, as a rule, stay out of the public political conversation. They don't give speeches at political rallies. They don't go on talk shows. They don't hold press conferences. That's by design. The Supreme Court is supposed to be above the day-to-day back and forth of partisan politics. Their job is to interpret the law, not to wade into the culture war. So when a Supreme Court justice steps to a podium, looks out at a room full of young Americans and decides that this moment is the moment to speak plainly and publicly about what he believes is happening to this country, you pay attention. You lean forward. Because justices don't do this unless they feel like they have to. And Justice Thomas clearly felt like he had to. So let's break down exactly what Thomas said, because the media, both left and right, has been spinning it in ways that miss the actual substance of his argument. He didn't just say, "I don't like progressives." He didn't just throw out a political red meat line to fire up a crowd. This was a structured, philosophical argument. A legal scholar, one of the most experienced constitutional interpreters alive, making a case about the origins of American rights, what threatens them, and what happens if we lose them. Let's start with the core of his argument. Thomas said that progressivism, as a modern political philosophy, seeks to replace the fundamental premises of the Declaration of Independence, not tweak them, not reform them. Replace them. Now stop. Think about that for a second. The Declaration of Independence is not just a historical document sitting in a glass case in Washington. It is the philosophical backbone of everything that follows. The Constitution, the Bill of Rights, every single amendment that has ever been added. The Declaration says that your rights come from God, or if you prefer a secular framing, they come from your nature as a human being. They are, as Jefferson wrote, unalienable. That means no government gave them to you, and no government can take them away. That is the premise. And Thomas's argument is that progressivism directly attacks that premise because progressivism, at its ideological core, holds that rights come from the government, that rights are granted by the state. That what you are allowed to do, what you are permitted to say, what you are entitled to as a citizen, all of that flows downward from Washington. And here is why that matters so much. Follow this logic carefully because this is where it gets real. If the government gives you your rights, then the government can also take them back. The government can redefine them. The government can say, we decided healthcare is a right. We decided housing is a right. We decided that this speech is protected, but that speech is harmful. We decided that your religious practice is acceptable up to this point, but beyond that point, it conflicts with a new right we just created. So yours has to give way. Do you see the problem? Once you accept that rights come from Washington, you have handed Washington infinite power over your life because now they control the source. They control the spigot. They decide how much water you get, when you get it, and when it gets turned off. That is not the America the founders designed. That is not the Constitution Justice Thomas has spent 30 years defending. And that is exactly what he stood up and said in that auditorium, in front of students, on camera, on the record. Now, here's the part of his speech that I think got the least coverage, and it's actually the most important piece. Thomas didn't just describe the philosophical threat. He described what progressivism requires of ordinary Americans in order for it to function. And the word he used was devastating. He said it requires subservience, not cooperation, not civic engagement, not working within the system, subservience, weakness, a population that defers to the government on questions of meaning, morality, rights, and identity. Think about that word, subservience. That is a word you use to describe a subject, not a citizen. Subjects are subservient. Citizens are sovereign. The entire design of the American system, going back to 1776, is that the citizen is sovereign. The government works for you. The government is accountable to you. The power flows from the bottom up, from the people to their representatives, not the other way around. And what Thomas is saying is that the progressive political project, whether intentionally or as a natural consequence of its ideology, flips that equation. It trains citizens to wait for the government to define their rights, to petition the government for their needs, to accept that the government knows better than they do about how to live, what to value, and what to believe. And once a population accepts that framing, that population is no longer governing itself. It is being governed. That is not a partisan observation. That is a constitutional one. Now, you may be sitting here thinking, okay, but this is just a conservative justice saying conservative things. Isn't this just political? Isn't this just his opinion? And that's a fair challenge. Let's address it directly. Here's the thing about that argument. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are not conservative documents or liberal documents. They are American documents. They belong to all of us. And the question of where rights come from, whether they are inherent to you as a human being or whether they are granted to you by a government, that is not a left-right question. That is a foundational question about the relationship between the citizen and the state. Thomas is not saying that everything progressives want is wrong. He is not saying that none of the policy goals of the left are legitimate. He's making a much more fundamental point. The philosophical framework that underpins the progressive project is incompatible with the constitutional framework that underpins American governance. And that incompatibility is not a small policy disagreement. It is a conflict over what kind of country this is. And let's be honest about something else here. Thomas also took a shot at a group that often gets a pass in these conversations, what he called the pragmatists, the so-called institutionalists, the self-described moderates and intellectuals who like to position themselves as the reasonable voices in the room. Thomas was not gentle about this. He said these people recast themselves as pragmatists and thoughtful moderates as a way of justifying their own failures to themselves, to their consciences, and to their country. That is a serious charge. And it's aimed not just at the progressive left, but at the entire class of political elites who pride themselves on being above the fray while the country quietly loses what makes it distinct. He's talking about the people who see the erosion happening and choose comfortable language over honest action. He's talking about the people who know the Constitution is being hollowed out, but would rather write a careful essay about nuance than say plainly what is happening. That's a critique that crosses party lines. And that's actually what makes this speech more significant than a typical conservative talking point. There's another piece of this that deserves its own conversation, and it connects directly to why so many everyday Americans feel the way they feel right now. Thomas specifically called out the growing prevalence of cynicism in this country, rejection, hostility, animus, not just toward political opponents, but toward the idea of America itself, toward the founding, toward the documents, toward the principles. And he said this cynicism is being perpetuated by Americans, not by foreign governments, not by propaganda operations run out of Moscow or Beijing, by Americans. By people who were born here, educated here, who have benefited from every freedom and opportunity this system provides, and who have decided that the correct response to America's failures is to tear down its foundation rather than build on it. And here's what makes that observation hit so hard. He's right. We live in a moment where the instinct in too many influential corners of our culture is to treat the founding itself as the original sin. To say that because the founders were imperfect, because the country had slavery, had oppression, had injustice, the entire philosophical framework they laid down is tainted and should be abandoned. But that is a catastrophic misreading of what the Declaration actually does. The Declaration of Independence did not say that all men are created equal, and America perfectly achieved it. It said all men are created equal, and here is the standard by which you will judge us. It established a measuring stick, and for 250 years, generation after generation of Americans, including Black Americans, women, immigrants, people this country wronged, picked up that measuring stick and held the country to it. That's how change happened. That's how rights expanded. Not by burning the Declaration down, but by demanding that America live up to it. That is the tradition Thomas is calling people back to. And in a country where cynicism about the founding is now considered a sophisticated intellectual position, where dismissing the Declaration as the work of slaveholders is seen as enlightened, someone standing up and saying, wait, no, these principles still matter and still need defending. That is a genuinely countercultural act. Now let's get to the part of the speech that Thomas saved for last, because this is where he turned from warning to rallying cry. He closed by talking about courage, not policy, not legislation, not which party to vote for or which candidates to support. He talked about the personal moral quality of courage and why it is the one thing this moment demands above all others. He referenced the signers of the Declaration of Independence. 56 men who, when they put their names on that document, were not making a political statement. They were committing treason against the most powerful empire on earth. They were signing something that, if the revolution failed, would be used as evidence at their executions. They had everything to lose, their property, their freedom, their lives, and they signed it anyway. And Thomas's challenge to the students in that room and to everyone watching was simple and direct. What level of courage are you willing to summon? Because you do not have to face muskets and British soldiers. You are not risking your life, but you are being asked to risk something. Your comfort, your social standing, your professional reputation, maybe some relationships. You are being asked to stand up and say, I believe in these principles. I believe this country is worth defending. I am not going to sit on the sidelines and watch it get redefined into something the founders would not recognize. And to the people who look at everything wrong with America and choose paralysis, who decide the problems are so big and the institutions so broken that participation is pointless, Thomas had a direct answer. If you think things are going wrong, get up and participate. You don't sit on the sidelines. That's it. That's the message. No complicated policy prescription, no partisan rallying cry. Just get up, participate, take ownership, take responsibility. Because if you don't, someone else will, and they will shape this country in ways that reflect their values, not yours. Let's zoom out for a second and talk about why this speech is happening right now, in April 2026, and why the timing matters. We are in the middle of a stretch in American history that is going to be studied for generations. The political polarization in this country has reached a level where the two sides are not just arguing about policies, they are operating from fundamentally different assumptions about what America is, what it should be, and who gets to decide. The courts are at the center of that battle. Every major cultural and political conflict in recent years, abortion, immigration, free speech, religious liberty, voting rights, executive power, has ended up in front of judges. The Supreme Court has become the arena where the most fundamental questions about American life get resolved. And in that context, a speech by Clarence Thomas is not just a speech. It is a statement about how he reads that moment. It is a warning flag being raised by someone who sits at the apex of the legal system and who is saying, I see what is happening to the philosophical foundation of this country, and someone needs to say it plainly. He chose the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence as the moment to say it. That is not an accident. That is a choice loaded with meaning. On the birthday of the very document he believes is under threat, he made the case for why it still matters. And here's the context that makes this even more striking. Thomas delivered this speech at a moment when the Supreme Court is actively deciding cases that will shape the country for the next generation. Birthright citizenship, voting rights, executive authority. The court is not some distant abstract institution right now. It is in the middle of the fight. So when the longest serving justice on that court steps forward and makes a public philosophical argument about the ideological battle being waged over the foundation of American governance, you have to take it seriously, whether you agree with him or not. So let's bring this home. What does any of this actually mean for you? The person watching this video, going about your life, paying your bills, raising your kids, trying to figure out what is real and what is noise? Here's what it means. The debate that Clarence Thomas is describing is not happening in some ivory tower somewhere. It is playing out in your school district, in your local government, in the courts that decide the rules you live under, in the legislation being written right now in Washington. The question of whether your rights come from God, from your fundamental humanity, or whether they come from the government is not an abstract philosophical debate. It is the question that determines how much power Washington has over your life. It determines whether you are a sovereign citizen or a dependent subject. It determines whether your elected representatives serve you or rule you. And the reason that question matters so urgently right now is because the answer is being rewritten in real time. Not through a formal amendment process, not through a national referendum, but through court decisions, administrative rules, legislative riders, educational curricula, and 1,000 small incremental choices that most people never see until one day they look up and realize the country has changed in ways nobody voted for. Thomas's warning is not that we are about to lose something. It is that we are already in the process of losing it. And the only way to stop that process is for ordinary Americans to wake up, pay attention, understand what is at stake, and refuse to sit on the sidelines. That is the call to action embedded in everything he said. Not vote for this party, not support this candidate, but understand your own country deeply enough to defend it, know your rights, know their source, and have the courage to stand up for them when someone tries to redefine them out of existence. And let me say something directly to you right now. If you are watching this and you feel like the country is slipping away from you, if you feel like nobody in Washington actually represents what you believe, if you feel like the system is being manipulated by people with power and money and influence, if you feel like the conversation is being controlled by people who don't want you to ask certain questions or reach certain conclusions, that feeling is not paranoia. That feeling is information. And Justice Thomas just gave it a constitutional framework. Here's the other thing worth noting. Thomas was not just speaking to conservatives in that room. He was speaking to young people broadly. He was speaking to future lawyers and judges and legislators. He was speaking to the generation that is going to inherit the America that this moment creates. And his message to them was, do not become cynics. Do not decide that because the country has failed to live up to its ideals, the ideals themselves are worthless. Do not let the people who benefit from your disengagement convince you that stepping back is the sophisticated response. The founders were not cynics. They were idealists who were also realists. They knew the system they were building was imperfect. They knew human nature was flawed. That's actually why they built in checks and balances, because they understood that no individual, no party, no institution should ever be trusted with unchecked power. The genius of the American founding was not that it assumed people would be good. It was that it assumed people might not be. And it built a system that could survive that. And the argument Thomas is making is that the progressive impulse, however well-intentioned at the individual level, structurally undermines those checks. Because when rights come from government, there is no higher principle to appeal to when the government overreaches. When the government is the source of your rights, the government is also the final judge of your rights. And that concentration of authority is exactly what the founders feared most. This is not about left versus right. This is about limited government versus unlimited government. It is about whether the American experiment, the idea that free individuals can govern themselves through their own chosen representatives, is still viable, or whether we are slowly, quietly sliding towards something else. That is the question Justice Thomas is asking, and it deserves a real answer from every American, regardless of political affiliation. So here's where we land. Clarence Thomas, a man who almost never speaks publicly like this, stood up on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and issued a warning that I believe every American needs to hear, understand, and sit with. He said, progressivism threatens the foundations of this country by replacing God-given rights with government-granted rights. He said the growing cynicism in our culture is eating away at the courage necessary to defend those foundations. He said too many people who should know better have retreated into comfortable labels, pragmatist, moderate, institutionalist, as a way of avoiding the hard work of standing up for what they actually believe. And then he closed with a challenge that cuts right through all the noise. Find the same level of courage the founders had. Do it for the future. Because the durability of this democracy depends on it. I'm going to ask you to do one thing right now before you close this video. Don't let this be just another thing you watched and scrolled past. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. a friend, a family member, a coworker who thinks politics is too confusing to bother with, because this is not confusing. This is actually the clearest possible statement of what is at stake right now. The conversation Justice Thomas started deserves to go further than a single speech at a university. It deserves to land in living rooms, at kitchen tables, in group chats, in the conversations that everyday Americans have with each other about what kind of country they want to live in. And that's what we do here at Nation Pulse. We take the moments that matter, the speeches, the bills, the court decisions, the things that are reshaping your life, whether you're paying attention or not, and we break them down in plain language. No spin, no party loyalty. Just the facts and the stakes delivered clearly enough that you can make up your own mind. If you got value out of this video today, please hit the like button right now. It costs you nothing and it helps more people find this channel. Subscribe if you haven't already. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you agree with Justice Thomas? Do you think the founding principles are under threat, or do you see this differently? I read every single comment, and the conversation you start in that section is just as important as anything I say on camera. Share this video, send it to someone, post it somewhere, because the people who want to control the narrative are counting on silence. They are counting on disengagement. They are counting on you thinking your voice doesn't matter. It does matter. It always has. And right now, 250 years after the founders put everything on the line, it matters more than ever. This is Nation Pulse. I'm glad you're here, and I'll see you in the next one.